Welcome to The Bridge. We have a special guest today. Einar Tangen is Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute. He's founding partner at the Center for China and the World, Macau, Senior Fellow, UIBE Center for Business Ethics, founder and chairman of Asia Narratives, former chairman of the State of Wisconsin International Trade Council, former advisor to KOTRA, K-O-T-R-A, Midwest region, and is often interviewed by Bloomberg, CGTN, and other media. Welcome to The Bridge, Einar Tangen.
Well, Jason, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, I love your introduction. It makes me sound kind of important and smart, which I don't always feel.
Well, I watch you on television. I literally turn the TV on and you're on it. So, for me, you're kind of a big deal.
Oh, really? Well, as I said, you need hobbies.
Well, I wanted to get right into it. One of the big discussion points lately, as of Janet Yellen's visit, and a little before that, is the term overcapacity, which seems to be, in my opinion, misused. But, you would know better than me. China is producing very high quality, affordable solar energy, onshore wind, offshore wind, EVs, and other electronic devices, batteries included, lithium products. And the U.S. response, as espoused by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, is that China is engaged in excess manufacturing of these products. Is there truth to this claim, and what's really going on here?
Okay, well, so about 12 years ago, and let's just take the electric vehicle industry. 12 years ago, China said, look, for environmental reasons, and also because this is a good business segment, we want to encourage industries to get into this. Now, that's 12 years ago. At the same time, the major car companies, because China was not on the radar in terms of international auto cars going around the world, they said, nah, you guys are jumping the gun. We're, it all in due time and all this type of thing. And we know cars and you guys don't. So lo and behold, 12 years later, China dominates the market. Why? Because they have the best technology. They're consumer driven. I mean, every car out there it's a brutal competition. To give you an idea, in 2019, there was over 150 different EV companies vying for, a shot. But, we know from past experience that, the auto industry generally boils down to 3 or 4 major automobile makers that could be larger in China. But still, you look at the US, Europe, and things like that, and you see a real pattern there. So it was inevitable that the number of companies would drain down. Has China been subsidizing that? Absolutely not. And the reason is because out of that 150 plus companies, there's only a handful remaining who are able to compete. And as I said, the competition is brutal. And I mean, in terms of price, in terms of the quality of the vehicles. And so China, jumped ahead. Now, because US and EU automakers are too big to fail. All right. They have now flipped the script and they said, well, it's not competition. It's because they're producing so many. Well, nonsense. People, no matter how many things I produce, if they're not good, no one buys them. And that's the funny part. Now, did China offer incentives to people to buy electric cars in the past? Yes, they have. And that has to do with the environmental reasons. They really needed to get the choking smog that the international press was always talking about, oh my goodness, you can't live in China because, the air is so bad. And every day they would be talking about PMI counts. Today, you go around in Beijing and you'll find that it's blue sky, blue air, not every day, but the vast majority of days. And even when it is a little overcast, it's not necessarily due to pollution. So China took action to correct problems that they had, take advantage of opportunities that are out there and become more efficient. Now, as I said, Janet Yellen, Regina Raimondo, Blinken, the 3 wise men have come forward with this, excess capacity, you're trying to ruin our economy. It's nonsense. I mean, back in the days when European and American car companies were dominating the world, remember? Mm-hmm. Oh, that was good. That was competition. This is American excellence at its best. And when, we've seen this scenario before. When Japan was rising in the 70s and early 80s, you used to see congressmen and senators out there with literally bats and
Yeah.
sledgehammers, whacking, Toyota and Honda cars as if, what did the car do to you? Anyways, same argument. They also, I loved it when they would take a sledgehammer to a Hitachi boombox. I just didn't quite know what that meant. They didn't like the music or what? In any event, they went after Japan. Everything that they're saying about China today was said about Japan then. Japan is using excess subsidized capacity to overwhelm our markets and take away American jobs. Well, what was the fact? The fact was the Japanese made a better car at a cheaper price. All right. Consumers reacted. If they had a chance to buy the same car that was American, they would have, but they couldn't. That's where the auto industry in the US and in Europe had fallen behind. So anytime there's a threat to U.S. Big business, and we've seen this countless times, the government comes in and says, in the interest of the free market, we're going to subsidize you. So the ironies, the hypocrisy is always there. But you can understand people in the U.S., not a good economy. Inflation is hitting hard. It's very polarized. People are afraid. The last thing they want to hear is that a good paying job is going away. But, Jason, there's one, I think. We just, 5 months ago, the auto union was on strike in the United States. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, it's time we got our own. And they did. They took a number of decreases in terms of pay and benefits during the financial crisis created by who? Oh, yes, that's right. In any event, they took these pay cuts and things like that, but they said, look, when things get better, we need to get back to speed. And it didn't happen. Instead, what happened is the corporate side decided to reward themselves by giving themselves about a 40% increase in total benefits and things like this. This enraged the auto workers, who then went on strike. But here's the question. The American auto industry wasn't exactly burning up, the world in terms of competitiveness. That was before, the auto workers obtained a 30% increase in wages. Now, the increase in wages is unrelated. They're not going to produce a single extra car because they got more money. So this is just inflationary money, more money added on to wages, where wages is the hugest differential between areas like China, and basically just say Asia, Africa, South America, basically the whole world other than EU. This is the difference. This is why it's more difficult for U.S. products to compete because of the wage side. So they've, basically, well, I keep saying basically, that's a bad thing to say. When they asked the leader of the auto workers strike, I said, do you worry whether or not this 30% increase will affect the competitiveness of the American auto industry? He said, yes, but we don't care. We're going to get what we have coming while we can. So this kind of short-term view is not necessarily the kind of thing where you're going to see a lot of competitive pressures pushing the American auto industry towards excellence again. And this is part of the problem. So I've been yammering at you for a long time. I'll let you ask the next question.
Well, I just wanted to go back to the issue of subsidies, because you mentioned consumers were incentivized to buy EVs in China. And I remember the exact same thing happening with Tesla. The United States was giving people incentives to buy electronic vehicles from Tesla for many, many, many years. But moving on, Gina Raimondo, with whom you mentioned, who is U.S. Secretary of Commerce, said she will, quote, do anything to prevent China from making gains in semiconductors, claiming, quote, we've out-innovated China. So the question, I guess the question is the question, when will China be able to make 3nm chips at scale? Or what else is at stake, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, Regina Raimondo is interesting. You have to understand a little bit about her background. Her dad worked at the Bulova watch factory. And post World War II, Bulova was a very good name for a watch, but it was kind of middle. If you really wanted something excellent, you'd go to Chopard in France or to Switzerland for Rolex, etc. So it was a very good American brand, but it wasn't able to compete when companies like Timex, I don't know if you remember that, takes a licking but
Yeah.
keeps on ticking.
Mm.
They overwhelmed the market. They produced every different kind of timepiece you can imagine, and it was a lot cheaper. Bulova decided that in order to keep the company going, that they needed to move their assembly to China. Now, that was a decision that was made in the boardroom, and it was made under pressure. I'm sure none of them wanted to do that, but they said, well, we don't have the marketing power of a Timex. We don't have the capability of reducing our costs because of the difference in wages. So they went. Now, Regina Raimondo's father lost a job. And she tells that story fairly often about this is why China is bad. It took my father's job. Well, China never took her father's job. And Bulova could have moved to Indonesia. They could have moved to Vietnam or India or any other place. Would she then blame them for, quote, taking their job? It wasn't even the decision that was made in China. So, but unfortunately, this kind of reflects this idea that the idea that many people have that China is somehow unfair, stealing jobs, coming in the middle of the night and taking factories and going back to China, and the next day you don't have a job. Well, actually, that story is more of an American story. If you go back to the late 1800s, Americans literally did that in England because there was a monopoly on cloth. So families and companies would go over there, buy a factory, disassemble it literally in the middle of the night, and ship it to America in order to break the monopoly. So maybe it's this kind of guilty conscience. That's what I would have done. So therefore, you infer that others will do that. So getting on to this idea you mentioned subsidies. It was not just Tesla, Nissan, Toyota, both had hybrids. It was available to anybody who was buying it because it was, for some reason, they thought that, not having pollution in the city was a good thing, just as everywhere else. But the idea of subsidies is all there. I mean, it's incredible that the U.S. would talk about subsidies when you start looking at Boeing. You start looking at the auto industry, you start looking across the steel industry, where the government has consistently intervened when they thought it was necessary in order to prop up industries, regardless of whether they were competitive or not. So wait a second, you asked me a different part of the question. Go back to it. Oh, semiconductors. Okay. So here's the thing with semiconductors. We always assume that everything is the way it is and it's not going to change, but it will change. Right now, in order to make these super, kind of concentrated chips, you need what's called extreme ultraviolet etching machines. Basically, the higher the spectrum, if you remember Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, violet, all right, the spectrum, violet is at the very end, and it has an incredibly intense short burst. So, and it's very narrow band. So you use this extreme ultraviolet light to etch the chips, the silicon. And then you can put the transistors all in it. They have billions of transistors in every one of these things. If you go down to 1.5 or 2 nanometers, you increase the number of transistors by 50%, 100%, whatever. So what does it take to do that? Well, the U.S. has cut off China from the Dutch company, ASML, from being able to sell high-end chip-making machines to Chinese companies or the Chinese government. They thought, well, that'll prevent China from doing it. But what has China done? They've used their mind. They start looking at how we can do this, but it's a stopgap. And that's where I'm going back to my original part of my answer. This is a situation where, technology does not stand still. Right now, we're getting towards the very limits of what you can do with silicon. And there are things out there, especially graphene, which is one molecule thick, very, very strong, can be bent like origami and has unique properties. There's also new things coming out in terms of gold nanoparticle sheet that also has excellent capabilities. And that's on an even smaller scale than what we're talking about today. So the historically, we know that we will be moving on to the next technology. And the question is, just like EVs, China's determination, or in this case, they have no other choice but to try to leap ahead instead of just trying to catch up. I mean, the problem is if you have the advanced technology and I try to catch up to you, you're always going to stay ahead, right? It's like running. I'm kind of behind. But if I leap ahead of you and I get to the next technology and able to perfect that, like China did with 5G and now 6G, with solar and with wind power, machines, robotics, all of these areas, then, of course, you have a much better opportunity. And this is very much in line with what China's trying to do. They talked about this new phrase, new productive elements and things like this. Well, it really means technology, but not just technology generally. It means trying to innovate, get ahead of the game, come up with the things that are necessary for the future, not only for the world, but also for China. So, yeah, this is a part of what China does in terms of when they're going to create a 2 nanometer. I don't know if that's necessarily important because, truthfully, there are very few commercial aspects that use that 2 nanometer chip. Yes, it's very useful for cell phones, but if you don't have a 2 nanometer chip, can you still make a phone call? Yes. Can you still connect to the internet? Yes. All right. In cars, it's not 2 nanometer chips that are being used. In fact, you want a larger chip because they're more resistive to vibration, especially in a car that's kind of moving around and things like that. And the same with the vacuums and the commercial things that you buy that have chips in them. They're at 24 nanometer, 48 nanometer. It's no effect on that end of the spectrum. If you're building a missile, a guidance system, maybe the 2 nanometer helps a little bit. But once again, I talked to some people in the defense industry who said, no, we really don't want those because they're too sensitive, all right? And, they can be interfered with, and you really don't want that missile being suddenly going off course. So they said, yeah, we tend to use bigger chips and things like this. So I was trying to hunt what is, what is, we always talk about, smaller chips as if that is the key to owning the world. But then when you start looking at the actual products that can use it, it's not that as essential as people think.
Well, let's move on again because our time is relatively limited, and I have a lot of questions for you.
Okay, so, sorry, I'll keep it shorter.
No, it's okay. I love the answers because it's a lot of information that I didn't already have. Since 1990, Western economists have often been talking about China's economy. Let's use the word collapse. That's the go-to word. But in 2021, 2022, 2023, that sort of rhetoric accelerated. It was like everywhere that Western economists were saying that China's economy was in trouble. Let's just look at 2023. It's the most recent example we have. China's economy grew by 5.2% GDP, and the United States economy grew by 2.5% GDP. Now, I understand it's harder for a more advanced economy to grow, so that's really good for the United States that it grew by 2.5%. But China's economy grew by more than double. So could you kind of characterize how is China's economy doing and what are its growth prospects for 2024?
Okay, so the economists will talk about something called a regression to the mean. You cannot grow at 10% a year forever because you basically will take over the universe at some point. So yes, there's always a regression to the mean, which means that your growth it starts out very high because of the opportunities there. Your economy is very small. And then as things go along, of course, your size increases and the growth becomes much harder. You're not going to double your growth every 2 years because, as I said, you'd be larger than the universe in a very short period of time. So China is doing fine. In fact, this has been predicted for years and years that China would be around that 5 to 6%. This is if you go back 10 years and you start reading the reports, the 5-year plans, the economic forecasts, they all said this. And that was said in the West as well. What you have here is just geopolitical competition. The U.S. is concerned about China, the second largest economy, which continues to always outgrow the U.S. This year, China will probably outgrow the U.S. by even more. And this is kind of frightening. So the response has been, well, we'll say that China's collapsing. If you go to the Economist on a yearly basis, the Economist magazine, which I respect, and tremendously good authors in there, lots of opinion. I like to read it. But every year, this is the year China collapses. And you have people in the U.S. who've made a living out of predicting that China collapse. Are they right? No, they've been wrong, consistently wrong. But they're hoping that, like a broken clock, at some point they'll be right. But I don't know that this is the time. I mean, let's just be frank about China. What are China's weaknesses? Its weaknesses are lack of resources. China ranks around 100 out of 200 countries, roughly, in terms of resources per person. Yet right now, its production is more than the next 9 countries combined. So you take all the production of the next 9 countries, and China is still ahead in terms of total production. China has, the issue of importing raw materials and exporting goods which it has added value to. This has allowed China to buy resources and to accumulate account surpluses as it goes through. But if the U.S. were to cut off China's ability to do that, it would be disastrous. And this is one of the things that I find very odd. It's kind of like this thing that China is, somehow about to fail, or that China is going to cut off, its own egress and ingress for raw materials and finished goods. Why would China literally destroy its ability to get 80% of its energy, oil through there, or to ship out all of its goods? It's actually the other way around. China is concerned about whether the U.S. would use a blockade at some point in order to do that. And I think that was probably one of the reasons they developed this Belt and Road idea, creating land bridges that go across to Europe and Africa and have other places that would be much harder for the U.S. to disrupt. But this all changed dramatically because of the trade with Russia. Because Russia, 13 time zones, immense resources. In terms of energy, every kind of mineral you can think of. They have a market themselves, and obviously they are at odds with Europe and the United States at this point. So by having a very firm economic relation, not military, China has assured itself that it has a huge backdoor that cannot be interfered with by the United States. And this is worrisome. We in the United States do not play well with competitive powers. We showed that with Japan. We knocked them down as if they were, papers. We forced them to sign the 1986 Plaza Accords. Today, to give you an idea, the Japanese economy is worth less today in real dollar terms than in 1986 when it signed those accords. And that was deliberate. We wanted to basically nullify any threat from Japan. Remember that back then they were talking about how Japan is going to take over the world. They're going to own the United States. We're not going to have an auto industry or a steel industry. Gee, does this sound familiar? In the event. So this China collapse thing, I think, generated a lot of snowballed during the pandemic because, especially as China and Russia grew closer together, this was something that the U.S. and Washington did not want to see. They weren't very keen on Germany and Russia getting together, and they were able, and tangentially or whatever, to stop that. Otherwise, Germany would still have that cheap gas, and their economy would be doing much better than it is.
Hmm. I hope the next question, I just want a kind of a faster answer, maybe. Some of the other
Yep.
following questions will be more lengthy. You obviously know a lot more about economics than most people. When you are evaluating China's economy in a global context, what metrics do you use?
In terms of metrics, it's not just econ. Econ is about creating models of the past and trying to project them going forward. What I like to look at when I see China is what is the size of the market? What is the productivity? How much additional income, disposable income is being created. Like last year, it was 6.2%. That means that you had 6.2% more disposable income per person than the year before. That tells you that you can, in fact, have a consumer-led economy because the more money in my pocket, the more disposable income I have, and the more choices I can make, etc. So those are the things that I look at. Innovation factor, the ability of China to plan is unparalleled in the world. Instead of having parties that go back and forth like a ping pong table on policies, China has these 5-year plans, and they do it. And they adjust. Something isn't working. They say, okay, we got to change that. And sometimes it's funny. I hear that from both Chinese and Western sides and say, oh, they're complaining. They changed the policy. And I say to him, he says, yeah, they did, didn't they? They said, yeah, that's terrible. How can we rely on anything? I said, was the policy working? Well, no. I said, well, what did you expect then? Perhaps it would be better to say, well, this policy isn't working. Let's try to figure out if they're obviously going to change the policy. Let's get one step ahead of our competition and anticipate those changes and take advantage of them. But I rarely hear that.
Hmm. We've had in the last year a kind of a reblossoming of Sino-US relations in terms of diplomatic relations. And obviously, that started with like business leaders, Elon Musk, Tim Cook, and others were coming to China regularly. Then we had Gavin Newsom from California. Blinken has visited twice, I think. Yellen is just finished her second visit. We have all kinds that we had Xi Jinping go to San Francisco recently. So Blinken just visited China again, but it didn't seem clear why he was coming, following immediately after Yellen's visit. And in hindsight, based on your own assessment, what do you think the U.S. Secretary of State hoped to achieve following Yellen's visit?
Well, I think it was a nice vacation from the Middle East. Obviously, Gaza is not the place he wants to be. He's been running in and out of there, and nothing has happened. Netanyahu seems to ignore him as if he was, the doorman at the entrance to the hotel. But there's this feeling in Washington, a very strong feeling, that American exceptionalism, this idea that America has to be in charge of the world and has to be leading the world towards this monotheistic idea of liberal democratic capitalism. And that, if you have to break a few eggs, kill a few people, start a few wars, it's okay because in the end, everything will be better. I kid you not, I'll talk to people. I said, well, we haven't had a good track record on this stuff. Sanctions, have they worked? Look at the size of the U.S. Look at Cuba. We've had sanctions on them for 70, 80 years or whatever. It hasn't changed. In fact, we galvanized the government and the people together because they felt that we were bullying them. So it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked in Iran. It certainly hasn't worked in Russia. Russia is going to grow bigger. It's going to grow faster than the United States and Europe combined. So that obviously isn't working. It has worked in a few very, very small countries, but in most instances, what it does is it galvanizes the leadership and the people together because they feel that their sovereignty is being attacked by, this overwhelming bully. So, we have these ideas about how we can do things. They don't necessarily work out, but in Blinken's case, he's very much an American exceptionalist, and you can go back over his writings and you can see he just, espouses it. He really does believe it. But coming here is really about, as they say, they like to set the guardrails. Washington wants to make sure that China understands exactly where things are. It's very paternalistic. It's not terribly appreciated. This idea that we're going to we're going to make the road and you stay within it. That sounds like colonial stuff. But you start getting into these areas where the U.S. thinks that they're being a responsible manager, even though at home things are not looking that great. It's not even clear that the road that they set out today will be the same road that Donald Trump follows if he is in fact the next president. So he's here. It's good. They're talking. They did agree to this idea of having, this artificial intelligence, looking at data, things like that, setting up a group to look at that. And that is very important, more important than people understand. Everyone talks about AI, but I remind them, garbage in, garbage out. That means that if the data that you're relying, that your algorithm is examining, if it's garbage in, it's not going to be able to differentiate. And as a result, all you get is garbage out. And we've seen that on countless instances where, these algorithms, basically, if you can manipulate them a little bit, they go crazy and start saying very, very awkward things. So that's kind of my take.
Mm. Well, I want to go back to the Belt and Road. It's not just a means to maintain China's channels for raw materials, but also it seems to be developing a lot of the traditional global South countries. And increasingly, China's trade is increasing more with developing nations than with the EU and the United States. Do you see a world with increased prosperity due to increased trade among global South countries?
Well, it's not what I see. I mean, you start looking at the numbers over these past few years. So starting at the beginning of WTO, as soon as China started taking a lead, you started to see a tremendous amount of growth in developing and emerging nations. It's not high enough, but more than they had enjoyed prior to that period of time. And China took it, went full throttle. And obviously, we know the economic successes they've had. But this economic success has a dual edge. For China, you say, oh, look, this is wonderful. We're doing great. For the U.S. and Europe, it's like China's coming up pretty fast. They're taking over our industries. They're out innovating us. They're more, they work too hard. I actually heard that from somebody. There was this great program where a Chinese company bought an American windshield company, and it was a documentary, and they had all the latest machines and everything like that. And the American workers were happy to earn $30,000, whereas literally 20 years before they had been earning $50,000 a year, when 50,000 in real dollar terms was a lot of money. But things had, the auto industry had deteriorated. They're happy to make 30. They came over to China, and the factory in China didn't have the automated things that they had, the machines and the machine assist and the robotics. But the factory in China was producing more than they could. And they were saying, gee, we'd like to do half of what they do. And these people were just working manually. And the lady said, well, I don't understand. They don't take any breaks. They're just working, as if this was a new idea. But it's culturally different. China's hungrier. People remember times when things were not good. Whereas the U.S., it's more nostalgic for the times that were good. They talk about, the good old days. And in fact, Joe Biden does that a lot. He talks about when his father could work a line job in a factory and still afford to take care of his family and things like that. And
Hmm.
that's just fast disappearing. But let's take a look a little bit at the nuances here. I don't think anyone believes that Biden or Trump are going to change their thinking dramatically, nor are the people in Washington, the elites. So China, I think, is kind of looked at this. There's a little bit of divide between national politics and then local politics at the state level. We saw that with Gavin Newsom. He's interested in trade. He's interested in the economy of California. If he was president, I don't know how he'd react. But you play the position you're in, and then you have two other areas that are the difference, and that is further along in terms of the economic interests. You have American companies who do not want to cut off their markets in China. For instance, all these chip making design companies that are now prohibited from exporting to China. Well, China's half the world's market. Okay, so where's your growth story there? And the U.S. is pouring money into subsidized chip making facilities, which sounds great, except it's not working out very well. And quite frankly, at some point in the future, you're going to have an oversupply of chips that will be very, very difficult to sell and will affect the market accordingly. And then the last, so you have the economic interests of these companies, and they say, look, we do not want war, we don't want conflict, we wanted profits and trade. And then the last part are the people. Because of, especially during COVID, you saw a dramatic decrease in trust levels between Europe and the United States, in particular with China. And the reason is out of sight, there was these wild accusations that somehow China started, the virus. Just, complete tin hat kind of stuff. It must have come from China. Because it manifested in China, it doesn't mean that it came here. And it doesn't matter where it manifested from. The Spanish flu did not start in Spain. It started elsewhere. It was just that Spain actually kept track of it. So they said, okay, there's something bad here. They became the Spanish flu. So the same thing with China. There are all these kind of accusations as if somehow China was going to benefit from this. Quite the opposite. China was hit very, very hard by the pandemic. So there's a feeling of this people-to-people exchange, how to get people back in touch with each other so they understand that neither side are monsters. American people are good people. They'll help you out. They're generous. They're kind. And they do care about things. And the same thing with the Chinese side. But, with the press and everything like that, you think that all Chinese want to kill Americans and all Americans want to kill Chinese. Quite the opposite. Very friendly. There's lots of opportunity to do it, but they have to get to know each other a lot better.
I think that dovetails really nicely into what I want to talk about next. Clearly, one of the things that has driven the United States to be so successful for so long is that it has a giant middle class. I remember in the 80s and 90s constantly being told that we were consumers and that was our role in society, almost like jokingly, but it's in every other movie that's made in America. Right now, China has at least 400 million people in what is called its middle class. And maybe that's growing. And Chinese people are super savers. They have an enormous amount of saved cash. So my question for you, is this drawing more, foreign direct investment, FDI, into China? Because everywhere I turn, I see American companies. I mean, even Taco Bell is here now. We have KFC, Taco Bell, in the grocery store. I buy a Gillette to shave my, face. Everything here there's a ton of American companies, including Hilton and others. So is China's gigantic middle class, which is probably the largest in history from what I understand, drawing in more international interest?
Well, absolutely. And by the way, Procter & Gamble will send you a little check for that very, very nice endorsement. Yes, American companies are ubiquitous here, whether it's McDonald's, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, which basically owns everything you use in your bathroom, from shampoo to soaps and cosmetics, all there, well represented. Yes, it's not only the fact that China has 400 million people in the middle class now, but China wants to get that to 800 million. So that means they're growing their middle class. In stark contrast to the United States, if you go back 45 years ago, 62% of Americans were middle class. Today, unfortunately, it's 50% and dropping. Last year, 60% of all people in the United States paid 50% or more either for their rent or their mortgage. And this, together with inflation, higher food costs, have made a lot of people very, very unhappy, and justifiably so. They feel that whatever the government should have done hasn't been done, that their lives haven't gotten better. Whereas in China, you see the exact opposite. Poll after poll by, Pew, outside polling entities point to the fact that Chinese people have a very, very high opinion of the future and of their government. Not unanimous. There are those who detract, of course. There are always going to be those who say, well, I would have done it differently. But the fact is, the vast majority do it. Whereas in the U.S., the polling shows that the vast majority of people are not happy with the current situation. There's a poll recently by Rasmussen that said that 40% of Americans think it is likely or very likely that there will be a civil war in the next 5 years. That does not point to a stable society of happy middle-class people who are wedded to the status quo. It talks about a lot of discontent. So, these are things that people should keep in mind when they start comparing the U.S. and China and things like that. It's the approach and what it means. Now, obviously, many in Washington feel that China is misleading the world with its prosperity, that China's success is somehow undermining the U.S. model. I don't think that's right, and I think history has made it very clear that there is no one model, there's no one culture, there's no one language. You don't homogenize people. You can take one language like English, and my goodness, you go around the world and you hear people talking English, including Americans. We came up with our own idea of what English is, and you go to Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Pakistan, you'll see that it is almost impossible to get people to do it. It's like the story of the Tower of Babel. Things kind of drift apart. But it's not a bad thing. It should be something that we embrace, try to understand, and appreciate the variety.
Hmm. Well, I guess I have a couple questions. I'll try to break them down. Well, firstly, what are the biggest growth sectors in China? Because from what I understand, green energy is one of the driving factors, or was at least one of the driving factors for China's economy in 2023. What other things is China really growing into right now?
Well, obviously EVs, they're making homegrown progress on, chips and things like this. Solar, wind power is still out there. Yeah, there are a lot of needs in the world. This is one of the things that it puzzles me why people say this. They say, well, China has an excess capacity for solar and wind power, and they're ruining the market. All right, let me see here. We need to transition to renewable sources. China is offering cheaper ways to do that. There's a huge need and a cheap source. Why is that a bad thing? All right. And you talk to people in the country, says, well, because we're not making it, but you're not competitive. All right. If you were competitive, you would be owning the market. And it's not, it's the difference is a lot of it comes down to wages. If I have to pay a guy $50 an hour in the U.S. versus, 150 kwai an hour in China, it really is a huge differential. And it's very hard to overcome. Maybe you can do it with robotics, but still land, everything necessary to build the factory. There's more red tape. U.S. has, different policies in terms of exports and things like this. Some they subsidize, some they don't. It's a tangled web, but in the end, it comes down to competitiveness. And right now, China is very competitive. In the future, the only thing I know for certain is that other countries will arise who have a different model, who are more competitive. And China's anticipated this with their Belt and Road. They're not trying to hang on to jobs that have huge labor components because labor is going up. Why? Well, they want more disposable income in China. They want to grow the middle class. You can't do that on a minimum wage. So yeah, they're saying, okay, these industries are going to go away anyways. Let's put them as part of this kind of overall trade thing. Let's help countries that could use these types of industries to put people to work. And guess what? When people get to work, they get paid. When they get paid, they can spend. And who produces a lot of intermediate goods and finished goods that are very consumer driven and also very attractively priced? China. So China sees the synergies. I think many times in the US, we see everything that's bad, everything that cuts against us, without necessarily understanding that perhaps we should be changing our model to be more competitive and to start growing our middle class once again instead of cutting it down.
Wow, there's so much to think about in what you just said. I'm going to have to process that for a long time. I was actually kind of curious because labor is obviously becoming more expensive here in China as, prosperity is increasing. And that's one of the factors that you just mentioned. But China also has more than half of all factory robotics in the world. And Chinese manufacturers are inshoring to places where wages are still low. For example, Gansu province. So as China is moving some of its labor, some of its factories to where labor is, at a lower price point, and it has some of the most advanced robotics in the world, and the most of them, is China the next China? What is your opinion?
Oh, I like that. Is China the next China? Well, I think China is China, and we'll just leave it at that. China is not trying to export its model. It's trying to cooperate with other cultures. It values the differences. It's not trying to say, this is how you should run your government or this is how you should run your economy. They've switched. Originally, they were doing government to government loans, but that was not good because the only thing you know for sure is when the government changes, you're at fault because that whatever loan the previous government took or any project they were involved in is, of course, bad, and China's at fault. So now they really switched over to project finance. They look at the feasibility of something like a solar array or a road, a bridge, etc., and they just say, okay, this works. We can fund this, and it doesn't matter if the parties change. It doesn't affect the government. They're not taking on loans. They might put up a guarantee, but the project's going to pay for itself. So China is developing its own model, its own way of relations, but it's based on this idea that you do you and I do me. And in terms of what you asked about in terms of labor, China, you hear this stuff that China's in some sort of demographic crisis, all right, because older people are getting, well, truthfully, a lot of the work that we're talking about done by robots used to be done by humans. And they don't need to do that work anymore. Just like in the past, the vast majority of people used to work on farms. Now they don't need to do that. But talking along those lines, 32% of the Chinese population is involved in the rural agriculture and economy. In the U.S., we're talking less than 2%. And we in the U.S. we grow more than we can possibly eat and consume. We export a lot, so the opportunity to cut down that is fine. The issue really is how do you take somebody who's worked in agriculture and train them so that they work in a digital economy, and that's really the holdup. It's not the number of bodies that's important. It's really about the training. And I often tell people, the country that prepares its people to work in the next economy will do better than those who don't. I think it's quite clear. And China is now putting a tremendous amount of emphasis on technical training, vocational training, trying to get people away from this idea that a white-collar job after going to Tsinghua Beida is the ultimate. If you really want to make money, you have to follow the economy. Not the economy isn't going to follow you. I mean, in many places around the world, they were hoping the economy would follow them. But the Industrial Revolution, kind of changed. It morphed, became the Information Revolution. Now it's the Digital Revolution. In terms of costs, China is determined to try to extend its ability to be a low-cost provider And this is where the robots come in. Robots are great. They can work about 23 hours a day. There's always an hour or so for maintenance, etc. um, and they don't require wages. They don't strike. As long as you have electricity to run them, they're pretty reliable. And as I said, they go 24/7. You don't have to have shifts of workers, the human resources, and things like that. You still have people working there, the people who maintain the robots, and you have to have the people who make the robots. They say they're going to have robots make robots, but that isn't quite here yet. It is changes, but what it does is it allows Chinese companies to be competitive worldwide in areas where you don't have to have a lot of handwork, where robots can do that. And that kind of flexibility, the willingness to change and embrace it, and not only embrace it, but lead it, is really where China's greatest hope is. Once it becomes more rigid and people say, no, I don't have to change, the world should change around me or change to suit me, that attitude doesn't work very well. And many people in the US are still hoping that the world will change to suit them instead of them changing to figure out how a place in the world.
Well, that's a fantastic answer. Our show is called The Bridge, as you know, and our purpose is to try to keep Sino-Western relations amicable. And I like to ask this of every guest I have. In your thinking, what are the best steps to deepen our diplomatic relations and to maintain a healthy and amicable set of relationships between the US and China?
All right, and I've answered this question many times. What it comes down to is, right now there's a huge push, and CRI is part of this, to tell the China story, right? To explain China. And my answer to that is always the same. That's great. But if I want you to listen to my story, I better be willing to listen to yours. And today, in a multipolar world where you have to drive things with consensus, I mean, it's not, the U.S. model of, if you don't do this, I'll ruin you, or I'll, we'll arrange a convenient accident, or a putsch or something like this. It really does come down to understanding other cultures, and we don't. If you go to the World Bank, IMF, the United Nations, countries have been historically defined in terms of their utility to dominant powers. So if you look at a profile about any country, it'll talk about what resources they have, how big is their population. They will talk about some cultural things, but mostly in relevance to political stability. But there's very, very little about the culture, the differences, the aspirations of the people. There's things just say this. Here's the history of the politics, and you get the sense that it's all very confused and no one's in charge. But it's not true. Many of these countries have deep, rich histories which are completely ignored. I was talking to somebody from Africa, one of the smaller countries that's in conflict right now. And, I said, people have no idea about your country. He said, we were a center of power. We used to be a regional player. We had doctors, astronomy, all these things. And yet all people know about us is conflict. I said, and if you go to the UN or World Bank or IMF, that's all they talk about. What are the problems? I think it's time that people listen to each other, and there has to be a way of defining that. And that's one of the projects that I'm doing at the Center for China and the World, is putting together a series of books which are curated by the governments. They cannot go into their problems with other countries, but what they can do is explain exactly what their internal aspirations are, who they are, their language, their poets, their things. It's not pie in the sky. I mean, many people in China will tell you, if to understand China, you need to read and write the language and speak it. You need to know who the poets of China were. You know, the dynasties, the history. You have to read the classic books. Then, you know, you can start to understand what China is. But until you reach that point, well, guess what? That's true for every single nation out there. They're not a bunch of savages. I mean, that notion that if you're not European or US, that you somehow, you know, you just, you know, like crawling around in mud huts on the ground and you never had a culture, completely false. Everything that came to the U.S. and Europe came via, you know, the Persian area, the Arab areas, things like this. That's where they had medicine and they had geometry and the ability to gauge the stars and even navigate and things like this. This was the centers of culture where they had real physicians, not people who would, you know, bury the arrowhead in the ground and hope that it would somehow cure you. So just remember that we are human, that we have differences, and that it's, I need to understand your differences, but I don't need to have to embrace them. E.g., what you do is fine. What I do is fine. We understand each other and we can work together with that basis of understanding. So I do think there is hope in the world. But as I said, it depends on, you know, if I'm trying to reach consensus with you, I can't do it if I don't really know who you are or how you react to things. You know, customs differences, you know, in some countries, you know, you don't shake with certain hands. And if you do, it's awkward. All right. Other countries, it's, if you get too close to somebody, it's just like, oh, you know, you're invading my space. Or if you're too far away, people say, oh, gee whiz, he's very distant. He doesn't seem very friendly. Until you understand those things, it's really hard to deal with each other. And both sides need to understand that. So I'm hoping that there's room to tell everybody's story. Not everybody is going to know every story. There's almost 200 countries. But it's important that somebody or groups of people within each country understand who their neighbors really are, what their aspirations are, how to work together. And hopefully that will, in the long run, you know, kind of like people-to-people diplomacy, lead to better understanding and less chance of conflict.
Well, that's a fantastic answer. I look forward to the materials that you're producing. Please send me a link of them, and I'll put them in the descriptions, or I can post them on my social media. Thank you so much for your time, Einar Tangen.
Thank you, Jason. A pleasure to be here.